Okay, Mark, thank you very much for making the time. Great to see you. For people who don't know you, just say a few words to introduce yourself.
Hi Fraser, I'm Mark Farr. I'm the Chief Analytical Officer at East Kent Hospitals, which is a big acute trust covering hospitals from Margate across to Ashford. And I'm also the Regional Lead for Analytics for Kent and Medway. So I chair a thing called the Shared Health and Care Analytics Board for the area. We've got a population of about 2 million people.
No, that's brilliant. And I want to start in incredibly broad terms and ask you a question that's, I mean, it might almost appear too obvious, but if you could just say a little bit about why you think analysis is so important in the world of health and social care. What's its value?
I think there's a kind of big general answer to that about, you know, big decisions with big budgets used to save lives and money and so on. But I think for me, kind of individually, I'd bring out a couple of key points. One's a particular interest to me around inequalities. So I think analysis is important for decision makers in health and care so that we ensure that inequalities don't get worse. So there's kind of lots of good examples of research that have showed that different people from different sort of social classes sometimes have different outcomes. So that might be examples like a mastectomy versus a lumpectomy. So we did some work with Imperial College a few years ago, which showed that your socioeconomic background had an effect on whether you were likely to have your breast repaired or removed. So for me personally, I'm kind of very interested in the kind of human geography aspects of that. I think the second key point I would make, and it's kind of an obvious one, is that analysis is used for direct patient care. So it has to have a rigorous model behind it. So if myself and my team develop a model that predicts which patients are going to deteriorate in the night, it's got to be a pucker model, because we're kind of diverting doctors and resources around in a different way. So you can't just rely on that kind of operational sense of smell. You need a really good model if you're going to make a decision based on it. And that's only going to get more important with things like AI and big data as they come along.
No, I like that, and I like the way you describe it as well. Both the decision making, sort of in an immediate sense about what to do with particular patients, but also decision making where attention is called to a problem that may previously not have been visible, particularly in relation to inequalities. I mean, how many times have we seen analysis that's shown a problem, that's pointed to a problem that previously we'd not seen as one of inequality? So that strikes me as really important as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly, as you know, particularly in this world of COVID, where kind of everything's upside down, there is so much analysis we need to do quickly and rigorously around, you know, ethnicity. Are there different ethnic groups that are more at risk or not? There's articles that show that there's a COVID correlation with deprivation. That may or may not be true. And interestingly, there's a paper that does some analysis in Birmingham that shows that it seems to show initially that COVID correlates with deprivation, but that's because Birmingham, compared to the rest of the country, is a deprived area. If you stratify Birmingham into deciles of deprivation, then the COVID infection rate looks quite flat across the deprivation groups. Now, this is a very fast moving science, but I think to your point, it just shows you how important it is not just to quickly go to an assumption that certain people are more at risk or less at risk. Another good example is, you know, quite senior people who should know better are saying, well, lots of people are dying this year, therefore less people will die next year and the hospitals will be a bit quieter. That's a massive assumption about the number of beds that we might need next winter. So I'm just trying to unpick things like that, kind of drawing in public health colleagues, working with the bed modelling team at the hospital to work out how many non-elective beds we need next year.
That's excellent. Really nice examples as well. I was going to ask you quite a general question about how well you think decision makers in health and social care settings use analysis. So talk about that, but also you've mentioned COVID, which seems to me to have changed some of the dynamics in terms of the demand for analysis and its use. So could you just say a bit about that as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think in a general point, to answer your question about is analysis currently used well, to what extent do we use the analysts? I don't think it's very good. So having come from the kind of private sector into the public sector, albeit almost 10 years ago, I didn't arrive with a very strong team of statisticians. That team didn't exist. We have a group of people who are very, very busy organising data, responding to the latest statutory requirement from the centre. So sometimes you only get time to count and monitor, and the time for actually doing analysis sometimes gets squeezed, and that's a kind of constant conundrum for us in terms of how well we use the analysts. I think because of that, you sometimes get what you might refer to as quite a lazy outsourcing to external consultancy, and it's nothing against that industry. You know, everyone has a role, but it may be that those types of consultancy firms need to be used for kind of big stakeholder management, program direction, but the actual drawing the graphs, I think that's for people like you and I, because we understand the nuance of the data and the fact that within you know, general surgery, this trust splits out breast and colorectal, this trust doesn't, and you just wouldn't have that knowledge locally. I think the slight cliche problem as well is, of course, you're never a prophet in your own land, and you can't always internally provide assurance in a way that an external voice can, and that could simply be your voice from Birmingham coming into Kent, or mine going the other way. So I think historically we've not used it well. I think there are some sort of green shoots of recovery, but I think the NHS has traditionally relied on quite a loud operational voice. You know, people who've been around this for a long time, and who, from a sort of sense of smell, know, you know, how best to kind of run a hospital. But I think we are seeing some change, actually, particularly around COVID, as you said.
This is a very specific question. Have you seen examples? I guess around the place we've seen examples where previously apparently insurmountable IG barriers have now crumbled, where analysts are being brought very quickly into decision-making processes. Have you experienced that? It sounds like you have.
I'm really pleased you asked that question. We've been trying for almost 2 years to get permission to link police and health data together to analyse intimate partner violence, on the basis, crudely, that one person's got a file of people who've hit their wife and another person's got a file of wives who've been hit. And actually, because of lockdown and I think risks around domestic abuse, we've managed to traverse that IG more quickly than I think we would have. So I think we've got one trust left in Kent just to go through a process. So we'll have quickly got 4 acute trusts to agree to link our data with the police, and that's not been easy. And, you know, respecting different people's views on IG, but I feel very strongly about this particular issue, and we've managed to get it agreed. And I think COVID has helped because of that. So I'm really pleased about that.
No, that's great. That's heartening to hear as well. And later on, I'm going to ask you about what you would want to do more of, or what you would not want to let go of now that we've got hold of doing it. And maybe some of the more pragmatic approaches to IG might be part of it. But you've talked a lot about the workforce, and I know that you've got a particular interest in the analytical workforce and its use. So your sense is, I sense from what you're saying, you don't think we make best use of our analyst workforce. It sounded to me on your account like we were doing too much performance reporting and not enough analysis, and not making good enough use of the NHS workforce as well. But just say a bit more about our use of the analyst workforce. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to some extent it's excusable because, and again, COVID illustrates this, every day a new SITREP comes out. So no matter how many analysts you've got, if you spend all of your day trying to agree the definition of suspected COVID and arguing the nuance of a negative swab plus a positive clinical indication from a consultant that they haven't written down anywhere, that by osmosis we're supposed to receive that information, you can easily lose a day trying to count some numbers to put into a spreadsheet to send to NHS England to fulfil a minister's question. And one of the things that I've kind of got interested in recently is the kind of concept almost of a hashtag of give us the data back. So if I provide data in a SITREP, say, and you do, well, I should only have to do it if I get your data in return in an appropriately anonymised or pseudonymized way so that I can actually do some analysis. Why would we all provide data that we don't ever, and we're not able to benchmark it against one another? it goes into this big machine. So I kind of resent that. In terms of how we organise ourselves, one of the things we're playing with at the moment is the idea of a data science team. And I make a distinction, which isn't right or wrong, it's just mine, of advanced analytics and applied analytics. And applied analytics might be using regression techniques to come up with a much better forecast of demand for next year than a simple trend line or what a CCG might do of last year plus 2% or minus 2%. And then advanced analytics, which is going into machine learning, natural language processing, neural network development, really exciting roles. Could we be scanning EPRs and working out that 3 doctors mean the same thing but say it in slightly different ways, write it down in slightly different ways, using that to trigger an alert for which patients are deteriorating at any one time. So I quite like this idea of some new functions, and I think if you try and hold those new roles in the existing structure, you'll struggle, because they will get sucked into the machine of reporting and monitoring. So I think you have to make a distinct, and I'm quite interested in what you've done in the West Midlands, you have to actually create a separate thing over here, call it a decision support unit or whatever else, and get people out of the melee of agreeing, regular returns, doing all the definitional work, the sort of the ETL of data, and actually have some people who are kind of much more interested in drawing the graphs and how we're going to draw the graphs and what type of graph should we draw and all of that. So I think there's a kind of a leadership role in how you start to split some of these functions out.
So I was going to ask you about that, and I don't know how comfortable you are describing your own experience or your own role in all of this, but it seems to me that the analyst as leader is really important in pursuing the sort of agenda that you've just set out, because demand is probably not going to come from anywhere else, is it? It needs leading, it needs defining, it needs structuring and putting in place. So what about the analyst as leader, and how have you found your role within doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like new territory. So I think there's 3 or maybe 4 people now with my job title in the country, and we're doing it not to promote ourselves, but to promote a function. So I think 20 years ago, you and I wouldn't have been familiar with a role called a Chief Information Officer or a CIO. So we have CIOs, we have CTOs. You now got these weird job roles called Chief Digital Officer, whatever that means. But I think increasingly you're seeing Chief Data Officer roles and Chief Analytical Officer roles. And crudely, and of course, everyone needs everyone else to help. So for me to provide live alerts, I need really good IT. So I absolutely need the CIO, but I have no interest in what a CIO does because I can't contribute to it. So I can't help. I don't care if it's an Apple machine or a Google machine. I need the dot on the screen to be green or red, and need it to update once a minute. So we're in a process, and we're doing some work with people like yourselves and the Health Foundation and others to promote the role of a Chief Analytical Officer, to literally write the job description for it, suggest what background you would need, suggest how that role would interact with a finance director, a chief medical officer, a chief exec, what it might do regionally, what it means for ICPs and ICS development. So as an acute, as working for a big acute, it's been suggested to us that we become the natural ICP lead for the region. Well, that all sounds exciting, but that now includes community data, mental health data. It includes monitoring different types of contracts, which aren't crude PBR ones. It includes developing outcome measures as opposed to performance metrics. So I think we would hope through the work that you and I and others are doing collaboratively, we could develop a good description of what that role would need. The work that you're doing is fantastic in developing a network for it. Do we go as far as having publications? What would the annual CAO conference be like? Who would be there? What would we talk about? So I think there's some really important thought leadership that people like you and I can kind of get involved in. I think what's key to that role is kind of making that link between and it sounds sort of a silly way of saying it, but kind of the tattoos and the cufflinks. So it would be easy to characterize the analysts as having tattoos and droning on about open source all the time, and it would be easy to characterize decision makers or execs as wearing cufflinks and making big testosterone fueled decisions about where to open new services and so on. And I think we need to move away from us being cross and throwing stones. We need to do that a bit, but we need the Trojan horse. We need to kind of get in and amongst them, and sometimes cover our tattoos with cufflinks, talk their language, but also be able to come back and have a debate with, you know, an external company about, well, why haven't you done an evaluation? You've suggested we do this, but you haven't provided an evaluation model, or you've just given us crude data instead of adjusted data. So you need to be able to kind of argue analytically, but also talk to the analyst as well. But most importantly, provide something that is understood at exec level, because ultimately those are the decisions that that's why those people are paid six figures to make big grand decisions about where to centralise stroke services, or how to open an urgent treatment centre, or which outpatients can be done digitally. You've got to be that really key translator between the analyst community and the execs.
And it's a rare beast that can operate in that quite narrow territory. Actually, it seems to me that the skills of the analyst, you know, yes, are technical. Of course they are. And there's a technical body of codified knowledge that the analyst has to, you know, be in charge of. And yet that it gets derided as softer skills, or described as softer skills. The ability to help people structure their questions, the ability to show where the uncertainties are but still guide a decision, the ability to say what you would do to shut uncertainties as things proceed. That's a rare set of skills, isn't it? And probably one that as a community we could do with developing more of.
I think so. I mean, I did something yesterday that I can send if it's useful, and even mention later. If you imagine a kind of very simple spider graph with 5 legs, it occurs to me that you need strong, we'll call them personal skills or emotional intelligence. And maybe they're things that you and I have to some extent. You know, we don't mind standing up and talking in front of people. We're interested in how to structure questions. We might translate to some extent. You then need very strong knowledge of NHS data, what it means, how it works, how it's organised. I think you need good operational knowledge of how hospitals and community trusts and so on work. I think you need some statistical expertise, and you might need some technical expertise. So technical expertise might be writing SQL. Statistical expertise might be building a regression model, understanding how outpatients runs, knowing your way through the data dictionary, and being able to talk to people. And I would score myself strongly and not strongly on those different metrics. So I can't write SQL anymore, but it doesn't matter because I've got people who can. And I have a reasonable knowledge of how outpatient works, but I've got some people around me who really, really get it. And I've got a good understanding of statistical concepts, but I couldn't build a neural net from first principles. But it's okay because I got a relationship with the university and so on. And I think you could actually profile jobs on that spidergram, which I don't think we've done before.
I was going to say, implicit in what you're saying, there's a career structure in there.
Absolutely.
And also a set of disciplines, or I don't know, ways of operating that you'd have to have as you progress, where actually the trick is not to be, you know, in charge of everything, not to be master of all, but to know where the boundary of your knowledge is and the boundary of someone else's might begin. It's a tricky territory, isn't it?
It is, because you're taking analysts and you're saying to some of them, if you want to, at the moment, if you want to progress as an analyst, or as anyone in the NHS, it prescribes for you how many people you need to manage. Now, you may not want to do that. You may just want to be a senior analyst on band 8C, where you're just allowed to build and play. But that job description doesn't really exist. You know, people like you and I might have made one up, but it's not a widely held job description. It says you need to degree, master's, PhD, you need to manage 5 people, 10 people, 50 people. It's a bit old fashioned. So I think that's the work we have to do, alongside defining job descriptions for a chief analytical officer.
No, that's excellent. Mark, I wanted to finish. I mean, in a sense, I feel like I've asked you a whole load of things about problems in the world, and of course I want to ask you about what you would do. How would we trigger the analyst revolution? What would it look like? Where would you start? So, and also I guess in some of the things that you said earlier about the response to COVID, what would you not want to lose? So what next? What would the more ideal world, what does it look like, and what would you do?
I think there's two strands to it. So one we talked about, which is that kind of development of that CAO role. I think that's a work stream which we need to do. I think alongside it, there is what we're starting to see under COVID, really shaking out, is the open use of data and the transparent sharing of data. And I think there's a role, and it's quite a difficult tightrope to walk. So you are sort of a commissioner, and I'm sort of a provider. So I can keep my cards close to my chest because I don't want you to performance manage me, and you can try and look in and see how I'm running theatres until I back you away and say, I'll deliver the RTT stand, don't worry about how I run my theatres. I think if you and I had a different relationship where we were working together in an independent way, we might still be paid by our host organisations, but we were allowed to have an independent voice, which has sometimes criticised how my trust works and sometimes criticised how you design services for the region. That I think is really important. I think if we can drive a kind of a greater independence to analysts so they can put data up without someone saying, well, you can't show that because it hasn't been through Gold Command or it hasn't been signed off by the Chief Medical Officer. I think we need to be quite bullish and say, we're just an independent voice. We don't work for you. We're not here to give you evidence against your enemy. We're just here to provide a kind of an independence. So because data intrinsically doesn't take sides. And I think if you just put it out there much more independently through the use of open data, much more transparent data, that's a drive that I think we should take. I think your and my analysts should be thinking, this is quite sensitive data I'm putting out there now, but I'm putting it out for good reasons. I'm not putting it out to embarrass someone or to score points, but I'm putting it out there because I'm worried. And it's how I'm really interested in, your role and how much independence you think you have, and how people like you and I can kind of work almost above that politics.
Well, I was going to say, this is too grand a comparison, and the day-to-day life of the analyst in the NHS is nothing like as glamorous as this, or as sharp as this. But the way that analysis has been used and analytical expertise, scientific expertise has been used to inform political decisions during COVID does illustrate some of the points that you've just been describing about carving that independence, about needing that independence, about being very clear, look, this is the advice, this is the data, this is what it says. The decision, that must of course rest with the decision maker. You can't, and trying to work out where that boundary is tricky, given everything we said earlier about actually, look, one of the things that would be better would be analysts and decision makers working more closely together. So it'll be a constant dance, that one, won't it? It
will, but I think people like you and I think you get to a stage in your career where you might take a few more risks. I think have to be quite bold and have to think, well, we're on the side of the angels. We're not doing this to be mischievous. We think it's a good idea to link police data to health data, not to, disadvantage anyone, but because we think it's a good thing to do. But so we have to be you need people at our age, crudely, to be bold and start to make these decisions, I think.
No, that's excellent.
And I think the thing I would be interested in discussing at greater length with people like you is that thing about independence, because we're wrestling locally with how we make that work, and everyone's kind of said, well, the only way it would work is if you took people out of their host organisations and put them over there, and I just don't think that will happen quickly. It might do, and I think what you've done there is quite interesting, because by creating a brand, you're creating some sort of independence. But I'm kind of interested in exploring that more, because in some ways my role is more straightforward than your role, because I work at the place where people who turn up who've got blood coming out of them, it has to be there. Whereas how CCGs, CSUs, ICSs, ICPs all get organised is a bit more kind of amorphous. So I just want to try and work out people on your side and my side work more closely and more independently, and with actually a stronger voice sometimes. You know,
look, it's a fascinating question in a sense. That's that's the thing that animates my professional life at the moment, is how you create an institutional setup that is as good as it can possibly be for the analyst who wants to do exactly the kind of thing that you're describing, to thrive technically, to be working on big questions, to get out of the day-to-day, to retain independence and yet be highly applied. So, and I don't think we've cracked it completely, but certainly what we're doing feels like it's multiple steps along the right line. And the strategy unit certainly does now seem to be attracting. I mean, when we recruit for analysts now, we're getting a very, very good response, and we've got some excellent analytical leaders as well, in exactly the mold you were describing. Again, we're not a finished product, are we? But no, certainly we're doing something interesting, and certainly I think it's something that people could merit from a closer look at and thoughts about replication of some of what we've managed to do. So Mark, one of the things that I know you're interested in is collaboration across with, let's say, industry or with academe, or with the third sector perhaps. So just say a bit about that as well.
Yeah, I think within the NHS we need to be careful that we don't assume that all of the expertise is held locally. And I have a frustration, personal frustration, and it's well-meaning. Things like NHS Futures, things like the Foundry, and all of these things, they're locked down. You have to have an NHS email to get into them. Well, the internet was designed at first principles to share information. It wasn't designed as a way of people creating little sort of fiefdoms all over the place. So there's plenty of people who don't work in the NHS that feel as passionately or more passionately about the NHS than some people working within it. So why would we not think creatively about how we might collaborate with charities, universities, industry partners? I think if we were more confident about striking the right type of arrangements with people, I think we would be well placed actually to not assume that we would do all of it ourselves.
No, I agree, and to seek those partnerships as stimulating technically, in terms of data, in terms of questions, in terms of application of things. No, I agree. I think that there is a danger that you think the answer is always within, and that we hermetically seal ourselves. But particularly links with academics, we found those incredibly stimulating. So no, that's great. Mark, I want to thank you very much for your time and your thoughts and your support for the Analyst Revolution.
Oh, I'm very flattered to be involved. It's good fun.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Cheers.